The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like distant thunder, casting long shadows across the sterile corridors of Elysium Labs. Buried deep in the Alaskan wilds, this concrete tomb was my world. Endless shifts monitoring gauges that ticked like heartbeats, the air thick with the metallic tang of machinery, and something colder, more elusive. Isolation crept into your bones here, planting doubts in the quiet hours, making every sound feel like a secret waiting to unravel. I adjusted my lab coat, fingers brushing the faded photo in my pocket, and pushed open the door to the control room, unaware that the silence was about to shatter. As I stepped into the control room, the familiar hum of monitors greeted me, but something felt off. The air thicker, laced with static that clung to my skin and raised the hairs on my arms. The dim overhead lights flickered, casting wavering shadows across banks of glowing screens and tangled cables snaking along the floor like veins in a mechanical beast. The room smelled of ozone and overheated circuitry, a scent that always evoked impending storms, but today it carried an undercurrent of something metallic, like blood. Elena was already there, her eyes fixed on the central console, fingers flying across the keyboard with manic precision. She was the lead researcher, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and hair pulled back into a severe bun, her lab coat pristine despite the late hours. "Marcus, you're late," she said without looking up, her voice cutting through the hum like a scalpel. There was no warmth in her tone, just the cold efficiency that had earned her a reputation as the iron fist of the project. Lydia paced nearby, muttering about neural feedback loops, her wild curls bouncing with each agitated step. She was the youngest of us, brilliant, but prone to anxiety, her glasses slipping down her nose as she chewed on a thumbnail. The technicians hovered like shadows in the background, faceless figures in their hooded suits, adjusting dials and murmuring status reports into headsets. We were on the cusp of a breakthrough with a new isotope decay process, a revolutionary method to harness unstable elements for clean energy. The facility, buried deep beneath the Alaskan tundra in a labyrinth of reinforced concrete and steel, was our isolated kingdom, cut off from the world above to prevent any leaks, literal or figurative. I double-checked the calculations, or so I told myself, repeating the lie like a mantra. Deep down, I knew I'd fudged a variable to cover my tracks, to push the results faster and prove my worth to Elena. The pressure had been mounting. Funding was drying up, and rumors of shutdowns spread through the halls. But guilt gnawed at me, a writhing thing in my gut. Memories of my old mentor, Dr. Harlan Graves, flashed in my mind. His ruined face after the lab accident I'd indirectly caused years ago, leaving him disfigured and broken. His suicide note still burned in my dreams. You knew, Marcus. You let ambition blind you. I buried that secret deep, but it clawed its way back now, making my hands tremble as I approached my station once more. "Initiating sequence," Elena announced, her voice steady but laced with excitement. She hit the enter key with a decisive tap, and the reactor thrummed to life below us, a deep rumble vibrating through the floor like the growl of an awakening giant. Gauges spiked on the monitors, needles dancing erratically as readouts flooded with data, energy outputs climbing, decay rates accelerating. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. The culmination of months of sleepless nights and endless simulations. Then, without warning, alarms blared, red lights pulsing like blood through veins and bathing the room in a hellish glow. Klaxons wailed a piercing cacophony that drilled into my skull as error messages scrolled across every screen. Containment breach. Critical failure. Panic surged through the room like a wave. "Shut it down! Shut it down now!" Lydia yelled, lunging for the emergency override. But it was too late. Radioactive particles escaped their confines, invisible tendrils seeping through the vents into the air we breathed. I braced for the burning sickness, the nausea and blistering skin that textbooks warned about. But it never came. Instead, a murmur slithered into my ear, soft and insidious. "Traitor." It was my mentor's voice, accusatory, from beyond the grave, laced with the rasp of his damaged throat. I froze, my heart pounding, the word repeating in my mind like an accusation I couldn't escape. I shook it off, blaming stress, the isolation of the facility, the long hours, the weight of what we'd unleashed. My vision blurred for a second, the room tilting as if gravity had shifted. The team gathered in the center, faces pale under the red lights, rationalizing the chaos. "Collective hallucination," Lydia said, her voice trembling as she clutched a tablet to her chest. "Isolation playing tricks on us. The radiation could be affecting our neurotransmitters, inducing shared delusions." But even as she spoke, doubt flickered in her eyes, and I saw her glance nervously at the shadows creeping along the walls. As lockdown protocols engaged, sealing us in with heavy clangs reverberating through the corridors, the wall clocks began ticking backward. Digital displays reversed, seconds unraveling like threads from a tapestry, while my desk photo walked before my eyes, the image of me and my mentor twisting, his skin peeling like old film exposed to light, revealing raw, glistening flesh beneath. I reached out to touch it, but my fingers met only cold glass, the distortion mocking me. The exits wouldn't budge, their reinforced doors humming with unnatural energy. When we tried to force them, barriers of shimmering air materialized, translucent veils solid to the touch, inducing a bone-deep terror that churned my stomach. It was as if the air had congealed into walls of fear, pulsing with malevolent intelligence. The calm spat static laced with pleas, my own mentor begging for justice in a voice crackling with pain, Elena's husband blaming her for his death in a car accident she'd always claimed was inevitable. "You worked too late again, Elena. You left me alone," the words hissed through the speakers, distorted but unmistakable, sending chills racing down my spine. In the corridors beyond the control room, Elena screamed, a raw, guttural sound bouncing off the metal walls. We rushed out to find her backed against a bulkhead, eyes wide with horror, pursued by a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, its form twisting monstrously. was her late husband, or some grotesque parody. Body elongated and emaciated, skin mottled with glowing veins pulsing like the reactor's core. He reached for her with clawed hands, murmuring accusations only she could hear. His face melting and reforming in a nightmarish cycle. She fired the flare gun we'd grabbed from emergency supplies, its burst of light illuminating the horror for a split second before it dissipated into smoke, leaving the acrid smell of burning flesh that wasn't really there. We huddled in the lab, barricading the door with chairs and equipment crates, our breaths ragged. The air grew colder, frost forming on the monitors despite the facility's climate controls. In hushed tones, we shared our nightmares, confessions spilling like poison from a wound. Lydia spoke of her fear of failure, how she'd lost a patient early in her career to a misdiagnosis. Now that guilt manifested as spectral hands pulling at her from the vents. One technician admitted embezzling funds, and as he spoke, his shadow detached from the wall, slinking toward him with predatory grace. Lydia theorized that the energies from the breach had hacked our minds, exploiting our deepest guilts and weaving them into tangible horrors. "It's not just radiation," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the distant groans of the facility. Or was it something else? "The isotope decay must have opened a rift, blending quantum fields with our subconscious. It's feeding on our regrets, manifesting them as these entities." Her words hung heavy in the air, and I felt a note of dread tighten in my chest. Mine hit hard. Illusions dragged me into a recreation of my childhood home, the lab dissolving into the familiar wood-paneled walls of my boyhood house in rural Massachusetts. The smell of my mother's baking filled the air, sweet at first, then souring into the stench of decay. In the living room stood my mentor as a vengeful beast, his body swollen and distorted, limbs elongating like tentacles, skin slewing off in radioactive patterns that glowed with eerie green luminescence. He forced me to relive the betrayal, the day I ignored his warnings about experimental protocols, prioritizing my career over safety, leading to the explosion that scarred him. "You chose glory over me," he snarled, his voice a chorus of cries, his claws raking across my chest, not drawing blood, but igniting a fire of shame that burned deeper than any wound. I clawed my way back to reality, gasping on the lab floor, my colleagues staring at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. Paranoia spread like a virus among us. I accused Elena of hiding her past, my voice rising as illusions hinted that she'd sacrifice me to save herself. "You've always been ruthless," I spat, the words tasting like ash. "What really happened to your husband? Did you drive him to it?" Her eyes flashed with hurt, but she didn't deny it, only turned away, her shoulders slumping. The technicians turned on each other, petty grievances escalating into fistfights until Lydia intervened, her voice a fragile thread of reason. Desperate, We scoured the facility's archives, unearthing old logs from encrypted files, reports of a government-hushed experiment decades ago. These revealed that the energies weren't mere decaying isotopes. They rewrote DNA at a subatomic level, trapping souls in eternal torment within the facility's structure. "It's a prison," Lydia read aloud, her flashlight beam trembling on the screen. "The breach creates residuals, lingering consciousnesses that latch onto the living, feeding on guilt to sustain themselves." The log detailed similar incidents. Researchers driven mad, bodies contorted in impossible ways, walls etched with pleas for release. We decided to improvise a disruptor, cobbling together a jury-rigged device from lab parts, electromagnetic coils and a salvaged power cell, pulsing with faint blue light. Activating it cleared some of the fog, the air shimmering as hallucinations receded like mist burned by the sun. But it revealed the true horror. Crumbling walls etched with ghostly imprints, faces frozen in screams, hands outstretched as if clawing for escape. The concrete was veined with bioluminescent growths, pulsing in rhythm with our heartbeats, as if the building itself had come alive. But casualties mounted. One technician, a quiet man named Reese, began to mutate before our eyes, his skin bubbling and melting like wax, features dissolving into a shambling mass that lurched toward us with guttural moans. "Help me," he rasped, but his eyes glowed with the same malevolent light as the shadows. Elena fired the flare gun again, engulfing him in flames that didn't consume him, but drove him back into the darkness. We didn't wait to see if he survived. The smell of charred meat lingered as we fled. We escaped through the vents, crawling on hands and knees through narrow ducts slit with condensation and something thicker, like ectoplasm clinging to our clothes. Shadows murmured from the grates below, draining our strength with every inch. Promises of rest if we just gave in. Visions of loved ones beckoning us to stop. Time looped in my head, endless betrayals replaying. The bad variable, the ignored warnings, the suicide note I'd burned but could never forget. Each loop tightened the noose of despair, making my limbs heavy and my thoughts sluggish. As we emerged into a service corridor, in a moment of clarity, I confessed to Elena. I altered the calculations, I admitted, my voice breaking as we leaned against the wall, catching our breath. I wanted to impress you, to make this work. It's my fault. She looked at me, her stern facade cracking, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability in her eyes. We all have our demons, Marcus, she said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. It was a fragile bond, forged in the crucible of terror, but illusions twisted it almost immediately, showing her abandoning me in a vision, her form dissolving into the shadows as she laughed, leaving me to the beasts. The facility warped around us, rooms shifting like a labyrinth from a fever dream, corridors elongating, doors opening to sudden dead ends, floors tilting at impossible angles. Ghostly apparitions materialized to siphon our warmth, leaving us shivering and weakened. Lydia collapsed once, her skin pale and clammy, muttering about feedback loops closing in on her mind. We pushed her onward, half carrying her through the chaos, our disruptor flickering as its power waned. We pushed toward the reactor's core, where it all began, illusions converging into indescribable horrors, amalgamations of our guilts, twisted hybrids of mentors, husbands, and lost patients, their forms merging into a writhing mass of limbs and eyes that blocked our path. The air thrummed with their collective murmurs, a symphony of accusations threatening to shatter our sanity. Elena clutched the disruptor, its light our only beacon, as we charged forward, the facility groaning in protest, its walls cracking like eggshells under the strain. Deeper into the core, the heat intensified, not from radiation, but from the psychic blaze of manifested regrets. Sweat poured down my face, mixing with tears I hadn't realized I'd shed. The mass of horrors lunged, tendrils snaking out to ensnare us. I swung a makeshift weapon, a pipe torn from the wall, striking at the illusions, each blow dispersing wisps of shadow but sapping my energy. Lydia regained her footing and recalibrated the disruptor on the fly, boosting its frequency to target the quantum rift. "It's working!" she cried, as cracks of light pierced the darkness and the entities recoiled with unearthly shrieks. But the toll was heavy. Another technician fell, dragged into the mass, his screams resounding as the horror absorbed him, swelling its bulk. Elena and I pressed on, our fragile alliance holding against the onslaught. Visions assaulted me anew, my mentor's beastly form towering over me, forcing me to confront the suicide note in vivid detail. The stained paper, the final words blaming me. "End it," he urged, but I resisted, channeling the guilt into resolve. The core chamber loomed, a vast dome pulsating with unnatural energy, its breached reactor at the center like a beating heart. Illusions swarmed in a tempest of guilt and shadow, but we activated the disruptor at full power, unleashing a blinding flash that seared the air. The horrors fragmented, dissolving into motes of light as the murmurs faded to silence. The facility stabilized, clocks ticking forward once more. But as the red lights dimmed, I wondered if we'd truly escaped, or if the residuals lingered, waiting for the next breach. As Elena and I staggered into the reactor's core chamber, the air throbbed with a sickly rhythm, like the labored pulse of a dying heart. Before us loomed a colossal entity, a towering abomination stitched from our collective nightmares, its body a writhing fusion of decayed flesh and growing isotopes, etched with the agonized faces of our lost loved ones. My mentor's eyes glared from one side, Elena's husband's mouth stretched in a silent scream, and Lydia's patient was woven into the mass like a thread of regret. It lunged, tendrils of spectral energy lashing out and dragging us into a shared illusion where time folded upon itself, an eternal prison of crumbling halls. There, we became the predators, our bodies rotting as our minds preyed on endless cycles of betrayal. I felt my memories unraveling, my DNA rewriting itself into something monstrous. But Elena's voice cut through the haze. "Embrace it, Marcus. Use the guilt to anchor us." She was right. I clutched the faded photo from my pocket, the one of Harlan and me, from before ambition poisoned everything, and let the shame flood me, not as a chain, but as a weapon. With a roar, I hurled myself at the control panel, slamming the overload sequence, while Elena fed the last of our disruptor's power into the Nexus. The entity howled as counteractive particles flooded its form, fracturing it into shards of light that screamed and dissolved. The blast hurled us back, the chamber shuddering as spectral energies dispersed in a cascade of fading murmurs. Lydia, poor Lydia, didn't make it. Weakened, she crumpled, her body flickering like a ghost as it repeated her patient's pleas for forgiveness. We had no choice. Elena exposed her to a targeted burst from the failing reactor, granting mercy in a flash of blue fire. Her final scream faded into silence, leaving just Elena and me amid the ruins, battered and bleeding. My arm shattered, vision still flickering at the edges of my sight. We jury-rigged a distress beacon from scavenged parts, its signal cutting through the static as the facility collapsed around us, walls buckling, radiation leaks hissing like vengeful spirits. Weakened remnants of the entities slithered in the shadows, but we evaded them, crawling through debris until rescue choppers breached the outer seals, their rotors thundering like salvation. They hauled us out, barely alive, into the biting Alaskan cold, where the wilderness stood in stark contrast to the tomb we'd escaped. Officials spun it as a meltdown, an equipment failure, our warnings dismissed as delirium. But Elena and I knew better. In the hospital, as I recovered, she leaked the documents, vowing to expose Elysium's sins and honor the dead we'd failed. Yet the energies lingered, subtle and insidious. I caught glimpses of Harlan in reflections, his grin predatory, eyes faintly glowing. And in my pocket, that faded photo now showed him decayed, planting doubts that isolation had once promised. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like distant thunder in the sterile hospital corridors, casting long shadows that felt all too familiar. Buried deep in my mind, this new tomb was my world. Endless shifts monitoring memories that ticked like heartbeats, the air thick with the metallic tang of regret and something colder, more elusive. Isolation had crept into my bones, planting secrets that unraveled everything, and as I adjusted my bandages, fingers brushing that cursed photo, I realized the silence had shattered forever, the residuals of decay now a part of me, waiting to awaken in the quiet hours.